Welcome to episode 73 of the Hidden History Happy Hour. Can you believe it, Alex?
Great to be with you, my friend. Good to be back.
Absolutely. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, we took part of another summer off, but unlike last year, perhaps, I think we have good reasons for that. Now, Alex, a couple things happened in your life this summer. Am I right, my friend?
Correct. And the most important is that the last time we spoke, oh no, it can't have been 6 months. Like Henry must have already arrived. But so it was, I was going to say the last time we spoke, there were two of us. Now there's three of us. The last time we spoke, there were three of us, but he was a lot smaller. Henry is now 6 months old. He is the apple of my eye. I could not be happier. I am that walking cliche at the moment. I know there's going to be lots of challenges in parenthood, but right now life itself is bliss.
Well, cheers, my friend. Mazel
Cheers.
tov.
Thank you very much.
How's the sleep?
No parent should say this with smugness and should be touching wood as I am as they do so because it can flip on a dime, but he's sleeping through at the moment. So
Amazing. Wow, that's
yeah.
great. Well, as for me, a couple major career changes coming, several announcements in a little bit. But for now, let me just mention that I'm enjoying a bespoke rye whiskey from our local distillery, Heritage Distillery here in beautiful Pacific Northwest. And if you can read that, folks, or if you're on non-video, this one is called The Great Escape. And that may or may not have anything to do with what my wife and I might do, depending on how this election comes out. But that's for another day. What
Also
do you
a great
sir?
film. Also a great movie, The Great Escape.
Yes.
I am. It's 10 o'clock p.m. in the UK. The temperature has dropped to 28 degrees in my own home, which is, I think, in your world, like 85, 86, something like that.
Yeah.
The needle has been, in your money, nudging 100 or above 100 today in London, which in a city without aircon is pretty savage. So I'm having a beer. I'm having a nice cold beer. I'm having Moretti, which I think has made it your side of the pond.
How many weeks a year are Londoners happy with the weather?
Reliably, maybe one, maybe two.
All right. I also want to note for our viewers that I'm using the official rocks glass of the Hidden History Happy Hour. There's a nice Kraken on there. Perhaps these will be available soon. You never know.
One of these days, we've got to tell a Kraken story, but we don't have one yet.
Okay, so Alex, as you know, we took a poll on social media of our fans. And speaking of social media, please, if you love the Hidden History Happy Hour, like and follow us on social media, leave us reviews and comments, and please tell your friends. But we took a poll of our fans on Twitter, momentarily known as X, kidding Elon. And by what would be an electoral landslide in a United States presidential election, 53% of you voted for Naval Daring Do and 47% for historical Games of Thrones. But don't worry, Royal War fans, we'll get to your preferences next time. But today, it is Naval Daring Do. Now, Alex, fun fact. Do you know the origin of the phrase daring do?
I do not.
From the Oxford English Dictionary, I think that's a university over there, daring do means action displaying heroic courage. The term comes in the late 16th century from Middle Eastern daring do, used by Chaucer, and in a passage by Lydgate based on Chaucer. You think I'm making this up? I'm not.
No, it's just your Chaucerian pronunciation. It's very
yes. Well, it's one of my tales. But it was misprinted in 16th century editions as another word, and this was then misinterpreted by Spencer to mean manhood, chivalry, and it was subsequently taken up in that way by Sir Walter Scott. So with that as background, what's our name? I know, Alex, you've been waiting to tell this story for a very long time. Perhaps because in our pilot episode, which people should go back and listen to, I explained how my hometown heroes were partly responsible for Great Britain's embarrassing defeat in the War of 1812. So what have you got?
I have a contrary story, and one of the reasons I've wanted to tell this story on the podcast for a long time is that I got this story from my late father. It's one of his favorite stories from history, and it's one of the ones I knew earliest. This is a story of a great son of Suffolk, which is where I'm from. Philip Brooke, it's spelt Broke, pronounced Brooke, and his ship, the Shannon. Indeed, for the rest of his life after this encounter, he was known as Brooke of the Shannon. 1812, we're at war with you lot. Contrary to expectations, the Americans are up 10-0, bigger ships, heavier guns, larger crews, more focus on the conflict. And Brooke was set on changing things. The crew of the Shannon drilled tirelessly, and Brooke set them challenge after challenge. So gunnery practice, sword play. He would give them scenarios. Imagine we're being attacked in such and such a way. What do we do? Fire the guns blindfold, reload blindfolded, instructions on your target being given orally to you by someone else. And it's that, it's over there, 2 degrees up and so forth. It's that dedicated crew and their ship that went to blockade the harbor at Boston. And they had a fierce hunger to do that which their comrades had not, to take on and beat one of these great Yankee ships. In the harbor lay one such ship. James Lawrence, captain of the USS Chesapeake, was there. And the Shannon the crews were taunting those in the harbor, come out, we're ready when you are. And in the meantime, as the Chesapeake remained in the harbor, safe behind its defenses, ship after ship sought to leave or enter Boston Harbor and sneak past the Shannon. Ship after ship was seized. Brooke sent them off as prizes to great loyal northern British North America, now known as Canada. More or less. The boundaries have changed a bit, but the good loyalists. But soon, doing that threatened to leave him undermanned, because in order to sail the ship you've captured to loyal British North America, you had to put some of your crew on it. So if you're going to have a real fight with the Chesapeake, you need your seasoned sailors, because he had to. So having had to man each ship with a prize crew, drawn from his own, he instead did something extraordinary. He burnt his prizes. It's absolutely very, very unusual in naval warfare of the 19th, 17th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. In the Navy, men made their fortunes from what they captured.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a mark of the fervor of the captain, but also the loyalty of the crew, that they were willing to do this. You may remember there's been one or two minor incidents of crews being less than wholly loyal to their captains when they thought they might do better. Exactly. So then the little boats of the ships they set fire to were sent back into Boston with their crews and their passengers aboard. And those men, almost all men, those people took with them the message again and again from the Shannon: we're going to keep doing this. Come out and fight, Chesapeake. And Brooke feared that Lawrence might never put to sea to fight. And ultimately, he remembered that Lawrence had written tauntingly to a British captain. So he wrote to Lawrence in the harbor, sent him a letter. And that letter is extant. We have the text. So he describes his ship accurately. He's completely honest. He says what its armament is, and he points out they're pretty evenly matched. And then he goes in for some 19th century sick burns. He says, I entreat you, sir, not to imagine that I am urged by mere personal vanity to the wish of meeting the Chesapeake, or that I depend only upon your personal ambitions for your acceding to this invitation. We both have noble motives. He goes on. You will feel it as a compliment if I say the result of our meeting may be the most grateful service I can render to my country, and I no doubt that you, equally confident of success, will feel convinced that it is only by repeated triumphs in even combats that your little navy can now hope to console your country for the loss of that trade it can no longer protect. Favour me with a speedy reply. We are short of provisions and water and cannot stay long here. Them's fighting words.
Well, were they really short of provisions and water?
You would have to go and reprovision at some point back to British North America, and the fear would have been the Chesapeake would have been slipped past them at that point. So, challenge made, challenge promptly accepted. Actually, historical footnote for the sake of the burning honesty which sits within us telling these stories. There's a quibble that Lawrence may not have actually got the letter, but that really ruins the story. So ignore that part. Lawrence had given a previous British ship in a previous encounter an absolute thrashing. And so I think he underestimated his opponent as a result. They reserved a berth in Boston's dock for the Shannon for after it was captured. So they were, go out and get this, and this is where we'll park it afterwards. They planned their victory party. And so every vantage point and height along the shore of Boston was crammed with spectators. And the Chesapeake put to sea, it looked a bit like a flotilla because so many people followed from Boston. These keen kind of war watchers. This was the entertainment of the age, following the Chesapeake, keen to get the best view of what they regarded as the inevitable triumph that was going to take place. As Brooke said, ships almost exactly the same length and width, guns even enough to make no difference. Chesapeake a little bit heavier. Also, not least because of what Shannon had to do with his prizes before, Chesapeake's got a bigger crew. 370 men on the American boat, 379 men on the American boat, 330 on the Shannon. Fair fight, even fight. They met 20 miles off the coast between Cape Cod and Cape Ann. Both ships hold their fire until they are at close range. Then American shots start being fired and go into the water, but their carronade fire went into an ammunition store, and that sent shot through the British ship pretty viciously. But the Shannon had the better of it. Her crew fired into the decks to kill rather than aiming for the mast, which so you aim for the mast if you're trying to keep the boat as a prize,
Right.
and you fire into the deck if you're trying to win. Some of the activity from the Chesapeake had been gloriously to take the Shannon as a prize. The Shannon was not messing about. They fired into the deck to kill. And his crew knew what they were doing, moment to moment. They'd been drilled until each step came naturally, even if they couldn't see what was going on in the course of the fog of war. Cue one of my favorite quotes from Josephus, the historian, who said of the legions of Rome that their drills were bloodless battles and their battles were bloody drills. I think that's really, really good.
Yeah.
And that's how Brooke and his men of the Shannon fought. Chesapeake's wheel shot away, sail on the Chesapeake lost. She yaws, which you lose her direction, she pitches. The ships draw closer, and the Shannon's crew lash the ships together. One man losing an arm in the course of doing that. You think about two big boats being forcibly tied together when one of the boats doesn't want to. It's not a peaceable maneuver. British fire remorselessly diminishing the Chesapeake's crew. When the time they thought was right, the British board the Chesapeake. They're outnumbered, right? They board the Chesapeake. Lawrence is mortally wounded. And his lieutenant, you say lieutenant, we say lieutenant.
Yep.
His lieutenant, William Cox, who had served with Lawrence all his saving life, carries his captain below deck. And Lawrence, there's great admiration, I say, of this for the opponent, for the foe. Lawrence's last words, tell the men to fire faster. Don't give up the ship. There are sharpshooters in the rigging of both ships. They're blasting away at each other and at men on the decks. Some American guns are still firing. Fighting on the deck is really fierce. The Americans rally, counterattack, but the outcome was becoming increasingly brutally clear. Brooke led the charge against the last knot of American resistance on the deck, and as he did so, the ships were blown apart by the wind, leaving the boarding party stranded. And the Americans in the rigging came down as fast as they could and surprised Brooke, ambushed him, and they wounded him with a saber cut to the head, laying him low. And the crew of the Shannon rallied to their captain. They countercharged and surrounded the fallen Brooke. Most of the Americans there are killed on the spot. And the remaining Americans who are below deck by this point, and there is a suggestion of cowardice in seeking refuge there that is not made by the British. It's lamented by one of the officers who survives from the American side, promptly surrender. Precisely, of course, what Lawrence did not want them to do. What I've just described took 10 minutes. More than 200 men were killed or injured. 23 of the Shannon's men were killed, 56 wounded. The Chesapeake had 48 killed and 99 wounded. That is one of the bloodiest single ship actions of the age. The Shannon, with the lieutenant commanding her, whilst Brooke recovered from his wound, escorted the Chesapeake to Halifax. What's the Canadian song about? I'm a broken man on a Halifax pier, the last of our privateers. Same place. And the Chesapeake becomes HMS Chesapeake of the Royal Navy. Hurrah. Brooke is made a baronet. Lawrence was buried with honours at Halifax by British officers as his pallbearers. I think it's a beautiful symbol. And history now records that Lawrence had rushed into the fight with a crew that was underprepared. He was overconfident of victory, and for understandable reasons, given the past and the state of the conflict between America and Great Britain. He underestimated an opponent far better than he had expected. After all, both sides took great punishment. but only one of them, no pun intended, broke. Still, we can recognize the bravery shown on both sides, especially by the captains who led from the front, and they did so to great personal cost. Brooke was never to command again. His wound was grievous. The saber had penetrated his head by at least 3 inches.
Ugh.
There are very few places on your head you can be hacked into 3 inches deep without having some real results. And he lived semi-crippled for the rest of his life. He died age 64. And the lessons I talked about in my book will sound like they're from a sports manual or a management text, but they are unavoidable. Practice until action is second nature. The practice is what makes the action successful or not. Second lesson, never underestimate your opponent. Third lesson, remorseless focus tends to win, even when it's held by an outnumbered and unfancied contender. And Brooke showed all of this, and that's why my father loved this story, and that's why I love this story.
Well, cheers to you. Cheers to your dad. Our fans
Cheers.
will know that
Thank you.
he's the inspiration for the book and the podcast. Of course, I mean, this book, Lessons from History, the OG. There's also a second volume. They make great Christmas gifts, not too early to order, especially if
That's
you're over
true.
here in the continent, I mean, in the North America. So that's one of my favorite stories, notwithstanding it was a minor bump in the road of us completely humiliating the Brits on the world stage. But
wasn't there a time that something happened in Washington? Isn't there some soot on the White House still? The details blur, but
yes, as
carry
my
on.
Canadian friends love to point out, that's right. Still standing, however. So a few things that come to mind, especially in the context of 2024. Oh, where, by the way, Slava Ukraini, as
Slava
we
Ukraini,
record
Ukraini, Slava.
this,
Yeah.
the Ukrainian military sits on a couple 100 kilometers of Russia. Didn't have that on my bingo card for this year.
No, neither did I. And I'll just say this about, I know, so you're going to say something first. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, and then we'll move off.
Well, so just on Ukraine, it's a mixed subject here in not in the UK where support for Ukraine is overwhelming, but across Europe there's some very mixed views. So the European Union says this is entirely reasonable in the course of a defensive war to make advances. Otherwise, how are you supposed to truly defend yourself? And it's artificial to merely to defend. But many European Union member states say that they support Ukraine in a defensive war, but as soon as sides take aggression to the other side, then it's far less clear. Italy has said they don't want their munitions used on Russian soil in the way that America used to, position from which you've rightly resiled. And part of the reason this is complicated is that most European weapons and materiel manufacturers cross borders. Parts may well come from Italy before they go into a British piece of kit, which goes into action in Ukraine or vice versa. And so governments have these very different views on pieces of activity in support for Ukraine. My point being, it was, whatever you think of this conflict, and I'm completely in support of Ukraine, it was monolithically Western nation support for Ukrainian action in defense of their country. And suddenly we're seeing some fraying of that support with the offensive action into Russia, which, by the way, for the avoidance of doubt, I also support.
Yeah, so as a law of armed conflict scholar, spoiler alert, that might have something to do with my coming announcement. I can tell you from the standpoint of generally accepted laws of war, armed conflict war, same thing. There's just no doubt. If you are attacked by an opponent, you are entitled, as long as you act proportionally and don't try to kill civilians unnecessarily and all the other rules, you're allowed to go after any of the enemy's infrastructure that could be used to make war, even if it's on their territory. Now, as a policy decision, the U.S. government, as we talked about this, I thought this was a mistake before we reversed it. And some other governments are saying, we don't want this to happen. But I don't think there's a credible legal argument here against Ukraine.
No. And look, most of us think there will come a time when, I think Russia is entirely in the wrong. I think Ukraine is entirely in the right. But there will come a time when pragmatically these sides sit down and talk. And some may argue that Ukraine's in a stronger position in that conversation if they've got some Russian territory, instead of the whole argument being how much of Ukraine is Kyiv supposed to give up before. For the avoidance of doubt, my position is zero, none of it. But that's the kind of discussion people are going to have. Is Ukraine's position stronger if they're in possession of some Russian territory? Now, that actually is not the same as the argument you were making. that is a kind of realpolitik observation, which may or may not be justified in the circumstances. But that's not the law of war discussion that you were
Right,
having.
right. And I'll just say one other thing about that, which is that, yes, I'm sure part of the objective here is to have a bargaining chip if they come to the table at a time when they hold this territory. But I think there's a lot more going on than that. I think, first of all, it's completely humiliated Putin. It's forced him to draw reserve troops from Kherson and Kharkiv to defend this.
Right.
And also, Ukraine is now sitting on one of the major gas distribution pipeline stations in Russia, and they may well take the nuclear plant there. So there's a lot going on, but here's my prediction. And when this airs, I'll either look like an idiot or not, or it's too early to tell. I think another piece of this is they want to lure Russia's most important combat aircraft to that area to try to attack the Ukrainian occupation troops, air quotes, so they can drop their put up their F-16s and shoot them from Ukrainian territory and take it down.
Well, the F-16s currently are underutilized. There was so much conversation about them going. Then there's a discussion about whether there'd be any help anymore. Clearly, of course, it's better to have them than not, I think. But you're right. There'd be more utility for them in that scenario. I read this week about the extent to which Russia is recruiting troops from other countries for the course of this conflict, from the former USSR states and elsewhere. And I mean, many of them are, go to Russia and then get effectively press ganged. Impressed, I think, is your term. But impressment. But I also think people are volunteering for it from other countries. It'd be extraordinary to me, but I suppose the promise of a better life or the promise of money and so forth, as people have always fought for, is drawing people. But increasingly, people talk about Ukraine's depletion of manpower, which is true. But there's a depletion on the Russian side too, of those willing and able to fight, and Russia is making up for it with people recruited from impoverished peoples, from impoverished countries, and they're having lifespans on the front akin to the First World War.
Yeah,
inexperienced, under-equipped, to the point we were just discussing about going in underprepared. I don't think they're overconfident, but they're certainly underprepared, and they're facing far better prepared Ukrainian military. Their use of drones has been extraordinary.
Yeah, it'll change warfare forever.
Yeah, I agree. And so I was going to say the Russian army, but the army that Russia is putting in the field, much of which isn't Russian, is getting chewed up pretty hard. And that's before you get to them suddenly having to defend swathes of Russia itself. Now, I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are marching on Moscow here, but it certainly changes the situation, doesn't it?
Well, and speaking of depletion of human resources, it's happening. So we're recording this in early August 2024, in case you're watching this in 3010 or something. The depletion of forces is happening en masse in the region that the Ukrainians have now taken and held. There are entire Russian volunteer units of the Russian military that are simply taking off their Russian uniform and putting on the uniform of the Ukrainian armed forces by the hundreds.
Yes, I've also seen more and more acts of vandalism within the Russian state. By the various terms they're using for them: terrorists, partisans,
sabotage,
Democrats, dissenters, depending on what you want to say of them. One of the things the Ukrainians have been so good at is using social media and using messaging services. And I am sure there are back channels to people saying, here's the reward you'll get for doing this thing. You want a better way of life in the West? Help us now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I'll say, and then we got another good story, but I wanted to say two other things about your first story. The last thing I'll say is, we talked about this in February 22 when Russia first went in. We can't get overconfident about this, but Putin constantly threatens to use nuclear weapons, and his toady Medvedev even threatens more. If they haven't done it by now, I think it's getting pretty unlikely they'll do it. I'm not actually sure Putin will survive this internally, but we'll see. Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraine. Yeah, Ukraine.
So let me just mention a couple other things about your story, which I also love. One is there's a certain single combat element to it, isn't there? I
Right.
mean, there were all kinds of theoretical ways that these two warring nations could have dealt with this situation. Theoretically, we could have sent other ships there from other locations. The Americans were certainly much more supplied, had better supply lines and communications
Oh,
lines than the
sure.
Brits. And yet,
Certainly to Boston. Yeah.
yeah, well, and even to Washington. I mean, or I guess New York was the capital, whatever was the capital at the time. But the question I have about this is, given how problematic and slow the lines of communication were in 1813 or whenever this was,
12.
does history talk about at all what Broke's orders were from London and whether he was told to do all this?
It's a good question, and I don't know the precise nature of Brooks' orders, but you will recall it's very accurately depicted in Master and Commander, and so some of the things that fascinate me are the extent to which military fiction authors are expected to be accurate in ways that authors of many other
Yeah,
things are not. They have far less latitude. And when Jack Aubrey in Commander of the Surprise is given orders to basically secure the ocean,
right.
identify that ship and take it on. You got that sort of orders.
Yeah,
Stop. So I don't know what Brooks' orders were, but stop the enemy from using Boston is a foreseeable sort of order that people would get in these circumstances. Use your own discretion thereafter. Yeah, you'd sometimes get a brief at the bar when I was a practicing lawyer that said, "Counsel will use best endeavors." They just
yeah.
off you
Well,
go. Do what
and
you reckon.
and that reality was widely exploited by Captains Kirk and Picard in the far
Oh,
reaches of the
5 year
galaxy.
mission. Yeah,
Yeah.
just off you go. Explore strange new worlds.
So one
Seek
other
out.
thing, then we'll
Yeah.
get on to the next story, and that's about the element of surprise. And I don't know if history knows this, but it struck me as you were telling the story because I read it 2 years ago, but I hadn't read it again before today. That maybe part of the way that the Chesapeake fought was based on its knowledge that time and time and time and time again, they fired for the mast, for the prize, and they didn't fire the
Right.
kill shot. And maybe that's what they were prepared for. And then Broke took advantage of that.
I think that's a good argument. I also think that they expected their opponents to be as underprepared as the past British troops that they fought. Bear in mind, most American ships had men from many nations on them, but those men had signed up because they had a belief in the shared future of the Promised Land. And British ships had people of many nations on them, but many of those people had been put in press gangs, and they weren't all, committed in the way that the crew of the Shannon were, and devoted to their captain in the way that the captain of the Shannon, the crew of the Shannon were. And so some of that I think would have informed it. But there's a really interesting thing not about what you do in expecting your opponent to behave rationally or irrationally. And it's so much harder to expect and predict and prepare for your opponent acting irrationally. Scotty Reston, who was the editor of the New York Times, has a whole argument about this. But I think here, I imagine that the crew of the Shannon expected their opponent to act irrationally. They expected the crew of the Chesapeake to seek to take them as a prize. And
Yeah.
they were absolutely mustard committed to killing off the threat of the Chesapeake. And you get these, in this kind of conflict, you will find that some ships are so important that they can change the course of battle in the theater. And
Just by
this
being
wasn't
there. Yeah.
correct. Correct. Fleet and being type activity. And this wasn't quite at that scale, but there were damned few ships of this capability on either side in the region at the time, and it was an important conflict.
And as we speak on August 12th, 2024, there is a ballistic missile submarine on its way to the Middle East, and there's a carrier
Mm.
group and a half there. And it's possible, if we're lucky and the stars line up and the mullahs in Iran aren't irrational, that those ships will change the course of war just by being there.
That is true. And if you are watching instead of listening, where it'll seem seamless, the blip that you may now see is me getting another beer.
Fair. And I'll do a little pour myself. That was a great story about what I, not as a naval historian, would call part of the golden age of sail and the golden age of sailing warfare. Now we have a story about the end of that age.
That's right. The last sailing ship of war is this story, and I'm very fond of it. The
Also from the OG, Lessons from
Also
History.
from the first book, Lessons from History. The Pass of Balmaha was British to begin with. Um, Built in Glasgow and launched in 1888. She was steel hulled and a little over 1,500 tons, and she had three fine masts. She was sold to the Canadians just before the First World War, and she was managed by Americans, and she understandably had her registration transferred to the neutral American flag when hostilities commenced in the First World War. As so often, you joined decisively but rather late in the course of that conflict. So America was neutral at its
Yeah.
outset.
Okay.
In June 1915, the Parser of Balmaha sailed for Archangel with a cargo of cotton. And she was stopped by the British ship Victorian, which was an auxiliary cruiser, which is another name for an armed merchant ship, which is ironic given what happens to Pass of Belmahar. But so the Victorian transferred a rather small prize crew to the point we were discussing in the first story.
Yeah.
Prize crew of an officer and six Marines put aboard the Pass of Belmahar with orders to sail to Orkney for
Sorry,
inspection.
Alex, did we say what year this is?
We did June 1915.
Okay, I want to remark on, I personally, as not a naval historian, am somewhat shocked that we were still doing prizes in 1915, but apparently the people were doing it.
All the time. And I tell stories in the Second World War. It's not exactly the same, but the course of the Second World War, people were seizing ships all the time.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
put a prize crew. It wouldn't be a prize crew to take it home, but for example, if you had a raiding ship, you would often seize a ship full of coal and put some of your crew aboard that, and periodically meet up with them at an agreed spot and refuel.
right.
And that's so the Germans deployed that as a tactic quite often. So, crew of six men and an officer aboard the Pass of Belmahar, and the British, interesting decision. I'm sure it was technically correct, but you might have got away with not doing this. The British men aboard the Pass of Belmahar ordered the American colours be struck, and they were replaced with the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Well, because that would mean his ship would be regarded as a belligerent rather than a neutral. The captain of the pass, a chap called Scott, wasn't very keen, but he did as he was told. Up goes the flag of the Royal Navy. Up pops a German U-boat alongside her, as if on cue in a bad joke. And oh, flip, Scott no doubt thought.
Yeah.
Down with the British flag, up with the stars and stripes. Oh, say can you see? I'm sure they all sang. Hide the Brits below deck whilst we're inspected, with my grateful thanks for your fantastic help hitherto. And displaying that the discretion is the better course, but a part of valor, the Brits promptly said, yeah, okay then, and scarpered below deck. But the U-boat captain concerned was not taken in by this business. I'm sure you could see some of this goings on through his periscope as the
Yeah.
flags were switched. And he ordered the Pass of Belmahar to sail to Germany for inspection instead of the Orkneys. And this Scott did. One of my favorite little details is he leaves the British shut up below deck on the way. You've been helpful enough as it is. And he had a fair idea of what was going to happen to his ship thanks to them and what they'd done. Incidentally, the Pass of Belmahar was that U-boat's last victim. She was sunk by the British ship, the Prince Charles, that same day.
Ugh.
So things weren't all going in Germany's way. The Prince Charles was a so-called Q ship, and I love this detail about the First World War. You would design a ship as a decoy to lure submarines. It looks like a vulnerable merchantman that you're going to sink and add lots of tonnage to your kill list. And in fact, it was heavily armed.
Yeah.
So the switch from civil to military is a real theme here. Pass of Belmahar gets to Cuxhaven in northern Germany without being waylaid yet again. The Americans were allowed to go on their way by the Germans because, of course, America was neutral. but the ship was seized by the Germans. I think we can imagine how the British felt as the hatches were popped on the deck and they were ushered into the welcoming arms of the Germans. But there, for you, Britisher, the war is over. And that was the end of their conflict. So any German ship that got past the Royal Navy's blockade of Germany struggled to resupply, given the point we were discussing. Because there was a real scarcity of friendly ports and allies to supply coal, and their colonial ports were nothing like as useful as the British Empire's colonial ports for these purposes. So, despite the advances made in decades of naval warfare, a fighting sailing ship that didn't need coal, this is the point, that wouldn't need to refuel, was thought to be worth having a go at. So the pass of Balmahar became, and Germans will have to forgive my pronunciation, the SMS Seeadler or Seeadler. Seeadler is the name of a white-tailed eagle in German, and it's spelled Seeadler, Seeadler. And it was equipped with a new hidden auxiliary engine, 2 hidden 105mm guns, 2 hidden heavy machine guns, and a pair of torpedo tubes. So suddenly, this seemingly harmless sailing ship, which was disguised as a Norwegian merchantman, had more teeth than a crocodile. So Seeadler passes her first test, which is the British stop her at the blockade, inspect her. She passes the inspection as a Norwegian merchant. She's got all this kit, right? Torpedo tubes, machine guns. She's got an engine tucked away, but somehow, like a transformer, they've managed to fold bits into other bits, and she passes the inspection. And she then leads the Allies a merry dance whilst inflicting great harm on our merchant shipping. 15 ships fell to the Seeadler over the course of the next 7 months or so. Imagine their surprise each time as a glorified yacht sends them to the bottom of the ocean. British, French, Italian, and then hurrah, you're finally in it, American ships are all sunk, incredulous by this ship of sail, ready to blow them out of the water if they don't surrender, which they always did. So, I was metaphorically saying sending them to the bottom of the ocean, that was the threat. She harvested vast numbers of prizes. She harvested vast numbers of captures. So convincing was the Seeadler's disguise that the last minute unfurling of the hostile flag of Germany and the demand to stop was sometimes disbelieved. The captain of one of her victims had himself rowed over to her. So convinced was he that it was a fellow merchantman pranking him. And in all of her captures, so they capture the prize, take some stuff, perhaps take the crews off. Interesting civility, right? You're at war. They take the crews off, and sometimes they might keep that ship. Most of the Seeadler's victories were sunk after they'd stopped them and taken the crews off. The Seeadler caused only one single fatality, and it was by accident. She fired at a British ship to stop her and take out her radio capability, which worked. And in the course of doing that, it wasn't even the shot. They ruptured a steam pipe as they fired on this British ship. Yeah. And that single shot ruptured a single pipe, which killed a single British sailor. That is it. All of the other crews were taken off safely. So the Seeadler's biggest problem might not have been immediately foreseeable, which is what to do with all these people, what to do with all these prisoners. And periodically, this gentleman raider of the sea would stop another ship and disgorge all of their prisoners onto that prize rather than sinking her, and order the captured vessel to put to port. Not, of course, without first ensuring that sufficient equipment had not been removed from that ship, so as to enable the Seeadler to get away before her released captive could report her to the Allies. On your honor, you will now go back to that harbour. And people did, but without their radio, so they couldn't warn in advance. All of that worked. For when the end for the Seeadler came, it was not at the hands of the Allies. It was at the hands of Mopalia, also known as Morphia, which is a beautiful and pretty much deserted atoll-style island, which is in the Society Islands. A wave threw her against a reef, and the Seeadler was destroyed. Nobody hurt. Every single crew member and every single prisoner survives. Now, you might think that the absence of a ship is a bit of a sticking point in being a raider, but the gallant crew of the Seeadler was not done yet. Felix von Luckner, the captain, splits his crew. He sails with 5 men in an open boat to the Cook Islands and towards Fiji, where he intends to capture a sailing ship, return to Mapalia for the rest of his crew, and just start raiding again. That's his plan. They reach an island called Attu, and they pretend to be Dutchmen who are crossing the Pacific for a bet. Now, I don't know about you, but I think at the height of war, some people turning up, yes, we are Dutch, having a bet. I think I might have been a bit skeptical, but luckily for them, everybody knows the world over that the Kiwis are sports mad, and the administrator or resident of the island was indeed from New Zealand. And he says, yeah, fair enough, sort of thing we do all the time. Of course, you're Dutchmen rowing across the ocean for a bet. So they give them enough supplies to reach the next island in the group, which is called Atutaki. And there they switch their story and they pretend to be Norwegians. And you might think actually the switch isn't helpful because second resident Kiwi, who may or may not have spoken to his friend on the other island, much more skeptical. But by this point, you know, they're armed men of war and he's not. And he's just a guy. He's just an administrator on an island. He hasn't got an army or anything. He can't hold on to them. So Luckner and his guys make off again to Rarotonga. He thought he sighted the enemy, well, perhaps. But what he couldn't see was there was a ship that had been beached on the way into that. It was dark, so he couldn't realize the ship was actually no threat. So he pushes on to Wakaya. By the way, he's now done 2,000 miles in an open boat.
Yeah, I was scared. You're going to say this seems like a long journey.
2,000 miles in an open boat, pretending periodically to be Dutch or Norwegian. And they try the Norwegian gambit again. This time, some people see through them at Wakaya Island, and the police come for them. They threaten to blow them out of the water. And there's something very admirable about this. He's just done 2,000 miles, right?
Yeah.
And not realizing that the police were unarmed. And people by this point were pressing all around their boat who'd rowed out to see them and not wishing to risk the loss of life amongst those people. This is at this point that this plucky half-dozen group of Germans surrender. That is the end of their odyssey. And von Luckner, who went on to become, you'd be so unsurprised to hear, given his gift of the gab and carrying off these japes, became a successful public speaker later in life. He did tours and give speeches. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war in lucky New Zealand sports mad who were quite pleased to see him. He did escape once in New Zealand, but was a bit more conspicuous, and they would believe he was neither Dutch nor Norwegian. He was recaptured. So that's the end of the war for the captain. But we are not done, because remember, the rest of the crew is back at Mapalia.
Right.
A French trading ship, the Lotus, is anchored off the reef, and informed of their gallant captain's capture by radio, the Seeadler's remnant crew, minus ship, minus captain, stuck on an atoll, captain being captured with some. They're
just guys on the beach now. Away.
These are guys on a beach. They sail out to the Lotus in their little boats and they capture her. They capture this French trading ship. Very politely and kindly, they promptly take the crew from the Lotus and put the crew back on the shore, along with all of their other captives and from the earlier prizes and sinkings. And they set course for South America, which, thanking their luck, they renamed their ship the Fortuna. I'm afraid some of their luck was bad. The Fortuna struck uncharted rocks off Easter Island, where the crew survive. It was wrecked, but they are captured by neutral Chileans once ashore, and they were interned for the remainder of the war. And thus the escapades of both the Seeadler and her divided crew were over. But not all of it, because the crew's capture in the Lotus, or Fortuna, whichever you depend, had left one last open boat. They'd left a boat behind on Mapalia on the island in case people needed it. That was kind of considerate, nice Germans that they were. One of the captains of one of the Seeadler's victims, so he'd been taken as a prize, taken as a prisoner, gets in this open boat with 3 other volunteers, and rows 1,000 miles. Oh, I'm sure they have a makeshift sail as well. I shouldn't exaggerate. They go 1,000 miles to Pago Pago. And thus it is that the Allies finally are brought up to date on what happened with the Seeadler, which of course had been a terror of the oceans and been seizing ships
Yeah.
all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were wondering what the hell where it had gone, who had sunk it. The answer was nature had sunk it. And because of those brave men going 1,000 miles in an open boat, the remaining captured and stranded sailors on Mopalia were rescued. Uh, One ship's, but 100 stories, and no doubt the strands of a story like that go on from all the sailings and captures and sinkings and so on down to our present day, if you can trace the family trees. But that is the way that the tales of one of the last sailing fighting ships of our world, certainly of the First World War, ended.
Well, for our fans who voted for Naval Daring Do, I don't think they could possibly just be disappointed by this episode. I just have two observations, not as a naval historian or a military man myself, but as an intelligence officer with our, situational morals and ethics, okay? The first one is, am I understanding correctly that during this era, if a U-boat pulls up and tells you sail your ship to Germany and then cruises away to be sunk by a destroyer or whatever, you do it? And if so, why? Just for honor?
I will very I release you upon your honor is something that has been in naval conflict, especially naval, because you haven't got the capacity to deal with the ship,
Right.
and you're not inhumane enough to sink them and kill all hands once you've won.
Right.
Putting people upon their honor like that is not uncommon. Indeed, and then in the Second World War, and I don't think we've told this story yet, but in the Second World War, the policy of rescuing people lost at sea was changed by the Germans. And it was one of the charges leveled against Admiral Dönitz, who
Yeah.
took over from Hitler after Hitler met his demise in the bunker. So Dönitz was a sailor for his country for decades and had a brief and inglorious reign right at the end of the Reich. And Dönitz said at Nuremberg, yes, it's true that I changed the policy to stop U-boats picking up people lost at sea. I did that because we broadcast our location and we told you what we were doing and who we were going to rescue. And we had boats of people rescued from the ocean being towed behind our U-boat. And you Americans fired upon us anyway and tried
And
to
that
sink us.
that story we have told, I think.
Yeah, and that is one of the few, you say what you like about justice at Nuremberg, and most charges were successfully brought. But that is one of the allegations that did not succeed at Nuremberg, because those concerned with those actions agreed that is why the Germans changed their policy. So not just in the First World War were people behaving honorably like this. Many instances of it in the Second World War and more recently too. But yes, in answer to your question, people would be released on their honor or released on giving their word to play no further part in the conflict. So in small units that were much put upon and couldn't afford to take prisoners to stay mobile. So the Schutztruppe in the German troops in Africa are another example, who would release their British defeated opponents if they pledged not to take further part in the conflict. And it's remarkable, I agree, but admirable too.
Gentler times. So my second observation, which may be explained by some of the backstory to the story, is in our first story, we were talking about 1813, 1814.
1812.
And we talked about the slowness of communications and the delay in orders and the like. In this story, they had radios. So
Yeah.
how was it that no Allied intelligence unit sent a cable or a radio transmission to all of the other ships and said, "Hey, watch out for this sailing ship. It looks like this. It's really a warship." How did they
Well,
keep getting taken in over and over?
so you got to remember, first of all, the nations that I mentioned, Britain, France, Italy, the United States, information sharing is poor. It's in different languages and it's
Yeah.
happening very quickly. And moreover, at sea, one ship can look like another very easily. In fact, both the First and Second World War annals. I mean, I'm talking about huge loss of life cumulatively. Many ships sailed peacefully up to an opponent because it looked like it matched in their mind the outline and resembled, sometimes accidentally and sometimes by design, a friendly ship. And those mistakes were easy to make. And one of the things to remember here is that the Seeadler wasn't seeking conflict with other fighting ships particularly. The biggest impact she could have was to go and harm supply lines, was go and sink or seize merchantmen. And now merchantmen were frequently armed. That's how the Seeadler was lost in the first place. But they weren't as tough as this bird. They didn't have torpedo tubes fitted and heavy machine guns and so forth. So, and if they did have a heavy machine gun, it was nothing like what the Seeadler was ready to do. So that's, I think, the explanation. But remember, too, in the immediate term, the Seeadler wrecks the radios or takes off the radios before they release their captives and sail promptly off in the other direction. So, yeah, you can get a good head start on your opponent if you've done that.
All right. Well, listen, great stories for the 47% of you who voted for Wars of the Roses and such. We'll be getting you next time. And the time after that, ladies and gentlemen, as we're approaching the crisp season of fall, we'll return for the third year in a row to Brian's Halloween Book Club. You will not want to miss it. Meanwhile, my friend, I will see you before then, and I will bring you one of these.
I look forward to it. I thank you very much. I hope that everyone who's persevered to this point will please like, subscribe, and tell a friend about the podcast. It really helps us out.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.